From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Sue Vita, the Chief of the Music Division. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, which is the 6th in a series co-sponsored with the American Musicological Society. We began these talks in 2008 with a lecture on Ruth Crawford Seeger. Subsequent programs have highlighted Irving Berlin, Arnold Schoenberg, William Schumann, and even one of my predecessors, former Music Division Chief Harold Spivak. Both the Music Division and the Society are pleased with the success of this series. Statistics demonstrate that the library's webcasts of these talks have a worldwide virtual audience and are even used in university curricula. Not only do they demonstrate the robust scholarship in American musicology, but they offer an enticing glimpse into the riches of the Music Division's unique holdings. We invite AMS scholars to present their work twice a year here in our historic Coolidge Auditorium. But also through these talks, we invite young scholars to consider investigating our collections, for I assure you they still hold myriad untapped treasures and research topics. This afternoon's talk by Anthony Sheppard highlights an intriguing link in works by American modernist composers whose compositions are housed at the library, and the influence of Japan on their musical expression. Before introducing Anthony, however, I would like to introduce a frequent visitor to the Performing Arts Reading Room, Professor Laura Yuens of the Department of Music at the George Washington University, who brings greetings from the American Musicological Society. Laura.
Good afternoon. I am honored to represent the American Musicological Society in what it rightfully regards as an important research initiative with the Library of Congress. As a longtime resident of this area, I have had ample opportunity to enjoy the wonderful resources of this library, as has today's speaker, Dr. Anthony Sheppard. He earned his BA degree at Amherst College and both MFA and PhD degrees from Princeton. Since 1996, he has taught at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, where he is currently professor of music. He has received numerous grants and awards, including an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, an Alfred Einstein Award, an American Philosophical Society Fellowship, and the Kortweil Book Prize, among others. His book, Revealing Masks, Exotic Influences and Ritualized Performance in Modernist Music Theater, was published by the University of California Press in 2001. In numerous articles, papers, and public lectures, he has addressed such topics as Tan Dung's The First Emperor, Harry Partch, various aspects of Japonisme, Philip Glass, Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, and representations of Japan in Hollywood films. Buttressed by the research he has carried out here, he will soon publish another book, Extreme Exoticism, Japan and the American Musical Imagination. Please join me in welcoming Tony Sheppard.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm honored to represent the many members of the American Musicological Society who have pursued research in the Music Division of the Library of Congress. I am also grateful for this opportunity to thank the librarians who have made our work possible. Many of my research projects over the years have led me to the library, for this is the place where countless projects are launched and culminated. It is also the place that sparks ideas, leading us to travel to other archives across the nation and the world. The vastness of the music division's collections sets the stage for dramatic moments of scholarly serendipity. During several research trips to the library over the past 15 years, I found myself encountering new topics that I had been unaware of before my visit. In fact, on a trip to canvass the music division's collection of Tin Pan Alley-era sheet music for songs with Japan as their subject, I stumbled upon an opera entitled Sakura, which you will hear about later on. I am currently completing a historical study of the relationship between Japan and the United States as echoed and shaped by music. A good deal of this book is devoted to the impact of Japanese music and culture on the careers of specific American composers, the profound Japanese influence on the development of American modern architecture, painting, theater, design, gardening, and literature has long been documented and celebrated in numerous publications and exhibitions. Less well known is the impact of Japanese traditional music in shaping American musical modernism. As early as 1882, the celebrated zoologist and Japanophile Edward Sylvester Morse pointed to Japanese music as offering ideas that could take the, quote, power of music in a new direction. Morse's statement proved prophetic, for numerous American composers have turned to Japan for inspiration as they sought to make music new over the past 100 years. The history of this cross-cultural musical interaction is documented in unpublished and published scores, manuscripts, photographs, and correspondence held often uniquely in the music division of the Library of Congress. Numerous American composers have responded in their music to the art and poetry of Japan, as well as to the timbres, rhythms, and forms of, for example, the Japanese shakuhachi flute, and gagaku, the ancient court ensemble music. The works of these composers have repeatedly spurred me to investigate the relationship between cross-cultural influence and exotic representations. This music likewise challenges us to reconsider our understanding of modernism and to ask which styles and techniques might qualify in different periods as forms of modern American music. Today, I will focus on but 4 composers, representing divergent periods, styles, and artistic outlooks, who each traveled to Japan and whose approaches to creating modern music were shaped by this experience. The first, Henry Eichheim, was one of the earliest American composers to pursue Asian music studies and was active in the teens and 1920s. The career of the prolific jazz band arranger and songwriter Claude Lapham was redirected toward Japan through one specific commission in 1933. The major American composer and educator Henry Cowell heard Japanese folk music as a child early in the century and traveled to Japan as a Cold War cultural ambassador later in life. And finally, Roger Reynolds lived in Japan between 1966 and 1969 and has maintained a deep personal connection to Japan ever since, collaborating with Japanese artists and writing about the music of modern Japanese composers. These 4 American composers of the same gender and race, but from very different backgrounds, one a classical violinist, the second a jazz band arranger, the third a homeschooled musical prodigy, and the fourth initially trained as an engineer, were each based in California during formative periods in their careers. Each of these composers is also well represented in the collections of the Library of Congress, which include the recent deposit of the Reynolds collection, offering a timely opportunity to explore the impact of Japan and Japanese culture on the work and musical thought of this major contemporary figure. I will consider each of these composers in turn and will offer some comparative reflections in the end. Following 21 years as a violinist in the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Henry Eichheim retired in 1912 to devote himself to composition and travel. During his second trip to East Asia in 1920, in a letter to his friend Carl Engel, who was then chief of the music division of the Library of Congress and later served as president of the American Musicological Society, Eichheim declared that Japan, quote, has a mysterious charm, a poetry no other country seems to possess for me. Eichheim appears to have enjoyed the pretense of temporarily collapsing the space between self and exotic other. In a 1928 letter from Japan to Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, the great music patron and donor of this very auditorium, Eichheim relates that he is staying in a mountain resort and living, quote, in a semi-Japanese manner, so that I eat raw fish with chopsticks and do many other Japanese things, all for the sake of local color. Musically, he believed that he had strayed far from the domestic. Quote, can you imagine the amount and kinds of music I shall hear during this time? I am sure a plain C major triad will sound like a strange, exotic thing to me when I return. Eichheim journeyed to Japan and other East Asian nations repeatedly between 1915 and 1937, and approached these trips as a collector, amassing an impressive set of musical instruments, taking numerous photographs of performers, and transcribing over 2,000 tunes. Eichheim's ultimate goal was to present these exotic cultural artifacts to American audiences. Writing from Japan to Coolidge, Eichheim is explicit, quote, we hope to hear some of the music that will be used at the coronation of the Japanese emperor, and as this is chiefly for small orchestra, I hope to find some priceless old imperial music that I may use in a piece I hope I may write for you. In addressing her as Lady Coolidge in this hopeful letter, Eichheim appears to be assuming the role of an imperial explorer in the Age of Discovery, or perhaps is serving as her art collector, playing the part of a musical Bernard Berenson to her Isabella Stewart Gardner. In addition to offering a mysterious charm, Eichheim felt that Japanese music could help direct Euro-American art music out of what he perceived to be its late Romantic impasse. In 1923, Eichheim complained that he could no longer work with the, quote, stiff and antiquated patterns of European forms, and he predicted that the music of the Orient, quote, will make our music ever more free and flexible in expression, claiming in 1928 that, quote, the future of European music can be enhanced and enriched by the finer sense of line and proportion and greater rhythmic scope of some of the music of the Orient. More immediately, he hoped that his own study of Asian music would help to separate his music from the conservative strand of current American composition. Writing again to Carl Engel, Eichheim enthused, quote, Japanese church festivals are fertile fields for strange sights and sounds, crowded streets, costumes and floats, always designed from traditional subjects, and the rhythms of the drums. Oh my, how you would enjoy these broken china effects that make the wildest ragtime sound like the safe and respectable 4/4 so dear to the heart of Arthur Foote. For Eichheim, Japan's strange sights and sounds offered a promising path toward modern music. Eichheim's reputation as a composer rests in large part on a set of short pieces, each inspired by his travels to a specific East Asian nation. The movements of Oriental sketches, including Japanese sketch and Japanese nocturne, were arranged by Eichheim for chamber orchestra in 1921 as Oriental Impressions. The manuscript copy of the piano version of Japanese sketch, as well as the manuscript copies of the chamber versions of Japanese sketch and Japanese nocturne commissioned by Coolidge, are held here at the Library of Congress. In each of these pieces, Eichheim attempted to evoke the sound of being there. In the Japanese sketch of 1918, Eichheim presented 4 exotic finds: the boom of the big bell at the Chionin Temple in Kyoto, the chant of a Buddhist priest, a shakuhachi tune, and a country boy's song. They are presented with the utmost clarity, with even greater melodic profile than heard, for example, in Stravinsky's treatment of Russian folk songs in Petrushka. Unlike Stravinsky, Eichheim most always identified his borrowed material in his scores and program notes. The implication of this score is that we are hearing a collage of the actual sounds of Japan, one formed of juxtapositions that we might encounter if we could but travel to the exotic land ourselves. Eichheim came closest to transporting his audience to Japan in his orchestral version of Japanese Nocturne, 1922. Here, the cherished sounds of Japan heard from his bedroom window, the shrill piping of food vendors, the plucking of a koto, and the chanted prayer of an old man beating a wooden bell float through a non-harmonic drone of tolling octaves and fifths and the lulling pulse of arpeggiated triplets befitting a nocturne. The most striking feature of this piece occurs near the end, as the old man's prayer, played by the oboe, is accompanied by his constant beating of a Japanese fish head wooden slit drum or temple block, a mokugyo, the instrument specified by Eichheim in the score. Eichheim's historical significance is credited largely to his early incorporation of numerous East Asian percussion instruments in his orchestral works, many of which he made available from his own collection for performances. At the moment the fish head drum enters, the representational system of the piece has been breached. Rather than translating the old man's drum, Eichheim purports to place the actual exotic musical object before his audience. Of course, such bids for authenticity often prove difficult to realize in performance, and Eichheim allowed for exotic substitutes in his manuscript score. Quote, "If no fish head drum, a small Japanese wood bell or drum used in Buddhist prayers, is available, kindly use a small Chinese wood block made by Deegan in Chicago." Here is the conclusion of Japanese Nocturne in a 1929 recording by Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. In assessing cross-cultural influence, it may seem natural to search for evidence of integration and a deeper engagement with the fundamental elements of exotic artistic traditions, of true influence rather than mere imitation. The evidence for such engagement in Eichheim's works is relatively slim, which perhaps partly explains his current obscurity. Eichheim appears to have been most struck by the floating pulse and ambiguous meter of some forms of Japanese traditional music, and this interest is manifested in several of his Japanese-inspired works, not to mention in remarks such as the sarcastic reference to safe and respectable meters I quoted earlier. A note pasted onto the second page of the manuscript score of Japanese Sketch that he presented to Coolidge states that, quote, "Extreme legato is to be observed throughout the piece. I would like it to sound as if there were no bar lines." In the score of the original piano version of Japanese Nocturne, Eichheim went one step further by abandoning bar lines altogether for the final melody, and noting that, quote, "The left hand and the right hand are to be played without time relation." An even more striking feature in these pieces is the occasional occurrence of pitch clusters. For example, in measure 19 of the Japanese Sketch, we hear the following isolated 7-pitch cluster lasting 2 beats. In the Japanese Nocturne, a 5-pitch cluster is sustained for several measures near the opening of the piece. And other clusters appear later in that work. I tend to assume that any pitch cluster in a Japanese-inspired work is a sign of the composer's knowledge of the Japanese show. A mouth organ that sustains clusters of 5 to 6 pitches used in gagaku, the ancient court orchestral music. In Eichheim's case, such knowledge is a real possibility, as some of his clusters resemble show clusters in interval content quite closely, and since he was likely the first Euro-American composer to hear gagaku. As we will see, he certainly was not the last. In a response typical of modernists after encountering ancient material, Eichheim and numerous other later composers looked upon the elite gagaku as an ideal source for the creation of modern music. In fact, gagaku itself could be claimed for the modernist flag, according to Eichheim. Quote, "Here we have music 1,400 years old, and yet so modern that if I had been told that the composition was by a radical, ultra-modern European, I would have believed it." Eichheim's influence on later American composers and on other artists interested in non-Western cultures has been underestimated. He served as a persuasive proselytizer for Asian music in the US through his letters, concerts, recitals, and articles. For example, in a 1928 letter held in the Library of Congress to the eminent conductor Serge Koussevitzky, Eichheim reported that he had heard gagaku. Quote, "In Tokyo, I heard the Emperor's Orchestra play the ancient music that was used at yesterday's coronation and found it very noble. I have written an article for a Japanese magazine about it, which you shall have when it is printed." His extensive collection of exotic instruments attracted significant attention throughout his career. Here we see Eichheim with Martha Graham. And he frequently lectured on Asian music, often in conjunction with performances of his works. In addition to highlighting the didactic motivation behind these pieces, Eichheim's lectures shaped his audience's oral experiences and responses. His wife performed the piano version of Oriental sketches throughout Asia and the United States. The chamber version of these pieces was first performed just down the road from Williams College at Coolidge's Berkshire Festival in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1921. And the full orchestral version of 3 of the movements was performed by multiple leading orchestras in the US and Europe. The chamber version was also performed in a recital sponsored by Coolidge and the Library of Congress, held in February 1924, just down the National Mall from here at the Freer Gallery. Eichheim's travels to Japan and musical travelogues set the stage for a century of American composers embarking on such exotic journeys. On June 24th, 1933, far from this auditorium, over 10,000 spectators witnessed some 2,000 performers in the premiere of Sakura, a Japanese opera pageant at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. This production was likely the most significant musical event for the Los Angeles Japanese-American community in the decade before World War II. Hundreds of children from all the Japanese schools in the area participated, and the Japanese-American newspaper Rafu Shimpo covered the production in intense detail. Both US and Japanese government officials proclaimed their support for this event, and even President Roosevelt expressed interest in Sakura. The Japanese Chamber of Commerce of Southern California had sponsored the production, intending, quote, "to promote a better understanding between Japanese and other racial groups in Los Angeles and surrounding communities." A timely intervention, given the rampant anti-Japanese sentiment of the day. Although Sakura has vanished from the history of American music, the work was revived in LA in August 1933, was performed 4 times in June 1936 in Portland, Oregon, and was apparently scheduled for production in San Francisco. An editor of the Rafu Shimpo, Yamitsu Sugamaki, wrote the Japanese libretto, which perhaps explains that publication's incessant promotion of the production. The plot of the opera might call to mind that of Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. A tragic heroine, Sakura, also the name of Japan's most famous folk song, is in love with a young priest named Zen, believe it or not, but their love meets with her father's disapproval. The father owes money to an uncouth lender who demands that heroine's hand in marriage as compensation when the father is unable to repay. The young priest and the moneylender later struggle violently, and the priest is stabbed to death. The heroine goes mad, and in the final scene, murders the moneylender and then wanders off alone into the forest. Attending Sakura at the Hollywood Bowl, the general public was able to experience something of the same sensation of being transported to old Japan that some wealthier Angelenos achieved daily in their domestic Japanese-style gardens. The set, which extended to the back of the shell and spread to the sides and in front, featured a large statue of Buddha, a waterfall with a viewing bridge, a small pavilion, and a torii gate. While the model of the set displayed on the screen is held at the Japanese American National Museum in LA, the only surviving copy of the score that I have been able to locate is here at the Library of Congress. The composer commissioned to write the score for this Japanese American extravaganza was the prolific white jazz band arranger and songwriter Claude Lapham. Despite appearing, quote, in native costume in this later publicity photo from Japan, Lapham was an unlikely figure to be tapped for the composition of a work trumpeted, inaccurately, by both the composer and the press as the world's first Japanese opera. Born in Fort Scott, Kansas, Lapham attended both Washington University and Juilliard. He served as an arranger for Irving Berlin and Paul Whiteman, as a silent film organist, as a music staff member for Hollywood studios, and as a conductor for Broadway revues. He was a virtuosic pianist who apparently was the first soloist to perform Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue on the radio. Lapham also published some 250 works, including popular songs, collections of dance music, and a book on scoring for dance orchestras. Prior to his work on Sakura, Lapham appears to have had no experience of Japanese traditional music. The Los Angeles Times declared Lapham's score for Sakura to be, quote, the first notable amalgamation of the two races in an art, and reported that in preparation for this work, Lapham had, quote, made an extensive study of Japanese music and customs in the Japanese homes in Los Angeles during a 6-month period. General reviews of the premiere were quite positive, with a more mixed response to Lapham's strange score. Sakura calls for a range of Japanese traditional instruments, including the shamisen, a stringed instrument somewhat like the banjo, and tsutsumi, a drum. Lapham employed several Japanese folk tunes that he labeled in his score, thereby suggesting that his other folk-like melodies were original. At several points, instrumental lines mimic the gradual accelerando, speeding up of the kakos, drum rolls in gagaku court music, or the hayushigi clappers of kabuki theater. The vocal lines remain almost entirely syllabic, and tritone intervals frequently appear for dramatic expression. At several points, the accompanying harmony is marked by pitch clusters that likely were inspired by the clusters of the sho, the Japanese mouth organ. In the press coverage and in his later writings, Lapham claimed to enjoy the challenges posed by the commission. In fact, Sakura marked only the beginning of Lapham's extensive engagement with Japan and Japanese music. Lapham became devoted to Japanese music following his work on Sakura, and his career focus changed dramatically as he followed Henry Eichheim's example by traveling to Japan and becoming a proselytizer back in the US for this exotic musical culture. 7 months after the premiere of Sakura, Lapham accepted an invitation from the Columbia Record Company to work in Japan on jazz recordings. He remained in Japan for a couple of years, and his compositional output accelerated markedly. During this period, he composed numerous Japanese-influenced works, including Miharayama, a Japanese tone poem for grand orchestra premiered by the Tokyo Symphony, and the Japanese Concerto in C minor for piano and orchestra, which was commissioned by the Victor Record Company of Japan, premiered in Tokyo by the Tokyo Symphony Orchestra with Lapham as soloist, and awarded a silver medal by the Takarazuka Film Company. The scores of both of these works from 1935 are held here at the library. Lapham's Japanese-inspired works range broadly in their relation to Japanese traditional music. His 6-minute tone poem, Miharayama, is devoid of any Japanese musical influence and features instead a rather generic, dramatic style that would not seem out of place as the main title music for a Hollywood gangster movie. One of the work's major themes recalls a tune from the New World Symphony of Dvorak. The most substantial of Lapham's Japanese-influenced works following Sakura was his Japanese piano concerto. Lapham's concerto is extraordinary and extends the style and materials of his earlier Japanese-inspired works. In this piece, Lapham includes a banjo part in shamisen style and calls for tsutsumi and taiko drums and a brass bowl imitating a small metal gong. The concerto lunges through stylistic shifts, recalling in turn the music of Rachmaninoff and Gershwin, and the interlocking percussive rhythms of Japanese Matsuri Bayashi, the street religious celebrations featuring flute and percussion, as well as European musical evocations of the gypsy. In an attempt to capture the essence of this piece, I will offer an extended montage of excerpts from the three movements in a performance with Lapham at the piano. From movement 2. And part of the third movement. Between 1937 and 1940, Lapham gave a series of lecture recitals on Japanese music that featured his Japanese-inspired works at such venues as the Hotel Astor and the Ritz-Carlton in New York City. Typical of these events is one in July 1936 at the International House in Chicago. The Chicago Daily Tribune announcement referred to Lapham as, quote, an authority on Japanese music and a pioneer in the efforts to adapt something of its peculiar idiom to the demands of accepted Western forms, thus forgetting its own native son, Henry Eichheim. Lapham's presentation in Chicago included excerpts from Sakura, the Japanese piano concerto, and Miharayama. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Lapham, not surprisingly, ceased his Japanese musicales and instead delivered lectures on Balinese music and composed works such as Iphigenia in Taurus and the opera Montezuma, both in 1942. Following the war, Lapham, along with multiple other American composers, resumed his focus on Japan. Lapham's extraordinary career illustrates how suddenly and thoroughly a composer may change direction through an encounter with an exotic musical tradition. Lapham also wrote on Japanese music and its history. In 1936, he declared that Japan was, quote, an endless source of inspiration for him, and that, quote, Japanese music is not easy to understand. In fact, it is subtle, complex, elusive, but withal extremely colorful and exciting to a serious student. In his works, he, quote, sought to blend the two viewpoints by producing a new type of musical idiom in which at least 75% of the music would be of Japanese texture, with the remainder European. In 1941, he stated that Oriental music loses much of its original flavor when transcribed for piano and orchestra, and he prophesied that, quote, in time, the beauty of both the Oriental and Occidental music will be merged into a transcendental form representing a truly universal medium of expression. In 1937, he recounted his own nocturnal experiences of a Japanese soundscape. But rather than echoing Eichheim's enthusiasm, Lapham lamented Japan's rapid musical modernization. Quote, I shall never forget how, when wandering out into a Tokyo suburb one twilight and mounting a beautiful curved bridge over a tiny stream to look over the thatched roofs, my meditations and illusions were shattered with a startling suddenness by the raucous strains of St. Louis blues. Some 2 decades after Henry Eichheim's trips to Japan and 2 decades before Henry Cowell's, we have found another American composer equally fascinated by Japanese music and repeating many of the same claims and aspirations for its potential influence. Japanese music and culture were of central importance throughout much of Henry Cowell's life. The influence of Japanese music is evident in one of his earliest works, the Oriental Movement of Adventures in Harmony from 1912, and in one of his last, the Second Concerto for Koto and Orchestra, 1965. Like Eichheim and Lapham, Cowell was instrumental in introducing Japanese music to other composers. In this image, we see him demonstrating the shakuhachi to the composer Edgar Varese. At the risk of accusations of myopia, I claim that Japanese musical culture was the most persistent exotic influence on Cowell, a composer who famously attempted to, quote, live in the whole world of music. Cowell encountered Japanese folk songs and perhaps even koto music as a child in San Francisco, but it is unlikely that he would have heard gagaku, the Japanese traditional music that had the strongest influence on his mature works. In fact, Cowell's earliest pieces on Japanese subjects really reveal little knowledge of Japanese music. For example, in the 1915 monodrama, Red Silence, Cowell, still a teenager, relied primarily on a naive pentatonicism and open fifth and fourth intervals to signal the exotic. The manuscript score is held here at the Library of Congress. The work is for a solo female character, Red Silence, who is waiting for her lover to return. She receives the sign of his death and then, as a good samurai's daughter in the Euro-American Japanismo tradition, commits suicide on stage. In setting her song Fresh Flowery Sprays, Cowell employed the black notes of the piano for the vocal line. explicitly parallel fourth black notes for the piano accompaniment. This form of musical exoticism did not require contact with Asian music. Cowell's serious study of Japanese music did not begin until age 37, when he met the shakuhachi performer and teacher Kitaro Tamada. Immigration records reveal that Tamada was born in 1894 and first arrived in the United States in 1918. He met Eichheim in the early 1920s, was Cowell's most crucial connection to Japan for 3 decades, and inspired several other American composers to study Japanese music. Tamada taught Cowell shakuhachi for a period of 4 years, continuing his lessons during Cowell's imprisonment for homosexual acts. Within 2 years of Cowell's release, Tamada himself was behind barbed wire in the Manzanar Japanese-American internment camp. He would spend the next 3 years and 8 months attempting to continue his shakuhachi performance and teaching while worrying about the future of Japanese culture in America. A most eloquent response and expression of gratitude to Tamada can be heard in the 1946 solo for shakuhachi, The Universal Flute, which Cowell dedicated to him. This work is one of the earliest by a Euro-American composer for an Asian solo instrument. The piece is in an ABA structure, typical of shakuhachi music, and Cowell calls for a great deal of the pitch bending and sliding tones central to shakuhachi idioms. For a composer who wished to live in the whole world of music, Cowell spent relatively little time outside the United States. Unlike Eichheim, who traveled to East Asia 5 times and for extended periods, Cowell visited East Asia only twice. He spent approximately 2 months in Japan in 1957 and 1 month in 1961. Cowell's first trip to Japan was part of a larger tour funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and sponsored by the Department of State, U.S. Information Agency. In 1961, Cowell served as President Kennedy's representative to the Tokyo East-West Music Encounter Conference. Cowell, along with numerous other prominent musicians and composers, proved an important participant in Cold War cultural diplomacy. His universalism and attempts to synthesize East and West in his music, however benign in motivation, worked hand in hand with U.S. Cold War efforts to form political bonds with Asian nations, particularly with Japan, much in the same way as did state-sponsored radio broadcasts, lectures, and concerts of American music abroad. Cowell's cross-cultural music and works of this period repeatedly present a somewhat formulaic dialectic. The most obviously exotic material appears first, then a more recognizably Euro-American style is presented, and ultimately an attempt is made to integrate the two. Cowell's major Japanese-influenced works of the 1950s and 1960s include Ongaku of 1957, the Concerto for Koto and Orchestra of 1962, the Concerto for Harmonica of the same year, and the Concerto No. 2 for Koto and Orchestra of 1965. Cowell repeatedly addressed the relationship between these pieces and Japanese music in a way that emphasized originality, creative synthesis, and the use of foreign compositional procedures. In his program notes for Ongaku, for example, Cowell stated that the piece, quote, is not an imitation of Japanese music, but an integration of some of its usages with related aspects of Western music. And he declared that, quote, all the thematic material is my own. There are actually no Japanese themes in the work. The two traditional Japanese genres shaping Cowell's mature works were gagaku and sankyoku, a form of chamber music for koto, shamisen, and shakuhachi in the realm of public entertainment. Cowell's long-term devotion to the solo shakuhachi is also evident in the melodic style of several of these pieces. The degree to which Cowell imitated gagaku and sankyoku in his Ongaku is suggested by details in his manuscript short score held here in the Cowell collection. He labeled the various orchestral parts with the gagaku instrument names and transcribed koto scales at the bottom of the first page of the second movement, presumably as a compositional aid. Several melodic gestures in Ongaku, including the flute introduction and the initial melody for trumpets, in imitation of the Ryuteki and Hichiriki parts, appear derived from the most famous of gagaku pieces, Etenraku. The most striking gagaku feature in Cowell's Japanese-influenced works of this period is his use of show-style pitch clusters. Here is the hieratic opening of Ongaku from a recording made in 1959 by the Louisville Orchestra, conducted by Robert Whitney. Similarly, the concerto for harmonica opens with show-inspired clusters in the winds and then in the violins. The harmonica part, surprisingly, avoids any suggestion of the show and contains no chords and only 2 dyads in the entire piece. Here is the opening of the concerto for harmonica, and I am grateful to Robert Bonfiglio, who premiered the concerto for harmonica with Lucas Foss and the Brooklyn Philharmonic in 1986, for providing me with a recording of that performance. Cowell's works from the Cold War period might at first appear far removed from the musical Japanisme of Eichheim. However, evidence from Cowell's sketches in the music division suggests a closer correspondence to Eichheim's poetic impressions. To what extent does a composition's title shape our experience of the work and our understanding of the composer's artistic stance? Cowell's original title for the 1962 Concerto for Harmonica was Haiku, Spirit of Japan, which is crossed out on his manuscript score, perhaps to steer listeners clear of poetic evocations of old Japan in the piece, and toward an appreciation of a skillful modernist abstraction of fundamental Japanese musical features. Likewise, Cowell's original title for Ongaku was Impressions of Court Music, and he initially subtitled the work's first movement, An American in Japan. Unlike Eichheim, however, Cowell composed impressions of a musical style rather than of an exotic soundscape. In multiple ways, Eichheim and Cowell differed greatly in their interactions with Japan and Japanese music. Whereas Cowell heard fundamental similarities across all cultures and claimed to identify with the other, Eichheim spoke of fundamental differences between the domestic and the exotic. Yet, in spite of their different approaches, we have little grounds for privileging one composer's form of cross-cultural music over the other. American musical responses to Japan have always been profoundly shaped by both personal motivations and broader social factors, as well as by current conceptions of compositional prowess. My final composer, Roger Reynolds, has had the most extensive engagement with Japan, even though traces of Japanese musical influence in his works may be the least immediately audible. Reynolds lived in Japan from 1966 to 1969, returned for 7 months in 1977, and has traveled to Japan on multiple other occasions. In addition, his decades-long relationships with several major Japanese composers resulted in their travels to and residencies at the University of California, San Diego, Reynolds' academic base. In this image, Reynolds is seen in California with composers Toru Takemitsu and Joji Yuasa. Although his experience of Japanese music and culture before 1966 was minimal, I note that in an early vocal work from '61, Reynolds set haiku poetry, and that his Japanese colleagues felt some of his pre-1966 pieces displayed a Japanese sensibility. Clearly, Reynolds was open to the world of Japanese aesthetics and to both the traditional and contemporary arts. Unlike many of the American composers I have considered for this project, Reynolds not only studied Japanese traditional music and theater, but learned the language and engaged substantially with contemporary composers, musicians, theater directors, and artists. Rather than serving primarily as a proselytizer for traditional Japanese music, Reynolds has played a significant role in promoting the music of such modern Japanese composers as Takemitsu in this country. In Japan, he organized numerous concerts sponsored in part by the U.S. Information Agency, and many of his works have been performed and premiered there. Reynolds has set and been inspired by Japanese literary texts, has composed for specific Japanese performers, and has responded to specific Japanese settings and aesthetic concepts in his music. In a 1982 interview, Reynolds was asked whether his, quote, non-teleological approach to articulating or structuring time was influenced by contemporary developments in European music. The composer answered emphatically in the negative and pointed instead to the profound impact on him of, quote, Japanese theater, the No, and more than anything else, bunraku. Also, I would have to say sumo wrestling. Same kind of thing, extraordinary sensitivity to the capacity of one to wait in the proper context. Reynolds' landmark 1975 book, Mind Models, begins with a quotation from Seami, the seminal figure in the history of Japanese no theater. In this book, Reynolds points to differences in time perception between Japan and the West, describes the unique approach to ensemble performance that he heard in Gagaku, and celebrates the, quote, timbric heterogeneity of shakuhachi music. Reynolds has also pointed to the wide range of vocal styles employed in bunraku theater as an influence on his Voice Space series. The 1990 orchestral piece Symphony Myths offers a particularly pertinent example. The work was dedicated to Takemitsu and premiered by the Tokyo Philharmonic. The first movement, entitled Futami ga Ura, was inspired by a famous rock formation off the coast of Honshu. Here, we see a drawing by Reynolds of the two main rocks with the three ropes linking them. This is Reynolds' first sketch. This first movement consists of three main sections. Reynolds has aptly described the outer two sections as, quote, massive pyramids of sound, tonally static, but densely figured with inner detail. The middle section represents the ropes in the formation, as three musical lines intertwine in a counterpoint that resembles heterophony, or what the ethnomusicologist William Malm once termed, quote, the sliding doors effect, prevalent in the texture of Japanese traditional music. The second sketch seen here begins to document the creative process Reynolds employed to translate the visual image into musical architecture. There is nothing exceptional or indicative of Japanese music in the instrumentation, beyond a few prominent gong strokes and a marimba part that suggests the woodblock sounds of a mokugyo, but Reynolds does call for playing techniques that create a rapid, irregular iteration in pitch, and a smooth accelerando that might, at least visually in the score, prompt a comparison with the accelerating kako drum rolls in Gagaku. Once again, the most suggestive feature of this music is the use of sustained pitch clusters. In this opening movement, we experience a sense of stasis, punctuated by lines of intense activity spiraling within. The pitch clusters heard in the first and third sections of this movement consist primarily of 5 and 6 pitches, as do the clusters of the show. In fact, the interval content of these clusters is quite close to a couple of the show clusters, and the dynamic swelling and ebbing of these clusters resembles the breathing rhythms of the show, even though the register and timbre do not highlight this similarity. Here are the opening minutes of this major work in a performance by the Tokyo Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Kotora Sato. My research on the music of Roger Reynolds at the Library of Congress, like the expansion of the Reynolds collection itself, will continue into the immediate future. As I proceed, I am faced with a host of questions. Which work should I focus on? Those that point to Japan in their titles, those created for specific Japanese performers, or only those works that to my ear suggest a direct influence of Japanese traditional or contemporary music? Influence is a notoriously difficult concept to pin down and phenomenon to document. For example, which instances of expressive silence or sonic space in his music are indications of Reynolds' appreciation of the Japanese aesthetic of Ma, and which can be traced to the pointillistic works of such European composers as Anton Webern? Should my research pathways be set primarily through conversations with the composer himself? Or should I first plunge more deeply into the collected materials housed here? To what extent am I predisposed to hear and see Japanese influence everywhere in his works? After studying the video recording of Reynolds' opera Justice, as produced here in the Jefferson Building upstairs in 2001, and now available on the library's website, I identified Japanese influence in the wide range of vocal sounds, the lack of stage sets, the limited number of actors, and the active role of the percussionist who accentuates the character's speech at specific moments. When I asked Reynolds about this, he replied, quote, "I had not thought about it, but perhaps so." The influence of Japanese music on the works of Reynolds is not as audible as it is in the works of Eichheim, Lapham, and Cowell that I discussed earlier. However, from other perspectives, we might notice some fundamental continuity in such cross-cultural music over the past century. As I move toward my conclusion of this project, and yes, of this lecture, I will need to consider the common ground between Eichheim's evocations of a Japanese nocturnal soundscape and Reynolds' construction of a piece inspired in structural detail by a Japanese rock formation and its legend. Much of Eichheim's approach to Japan was shaped by the writings of the American Japanophile Lafcadio Hearn, including Hearn's 1896 book Kokoro, Hints and Echoes of Japanese Inner Life. Reynolds composed a work for solo violin directly shaped by the discussion of the term kokoro in Daisetsu Suzuki's 1970 landmark book, Zen and Japanese Culture. In an interview with Takemitsu, Reynolds stated, quote, "It's the making of seemingly remote associations that's the most essential part of exciting art. By considering the music of Eichheim, Lapham, Cowell, and Reynolds today, I have aimed to suggest such seemingly remote associations and to reveal both the significant differences and clear strands of continuity between all four composers in their engagements with Japan. Ultimately, I hope to have offered some indication of the fundamental role that Japanese music, either directly experienced or imagined, has played for a wide variety of American composers negotiating routes to musical modernism. I look forward to my own research projects that undoubtedly will root me back repeatedly to the music division of the Library of Congress. Thank you very much." Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.